I'm talking to Jerry Baker. Jerry Baker is currently an editor at large for the Wall Street Journal. He was formerly, until recently, the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, and he's the author of a new book titled American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions and How We Can Rebuild Confidence. Jerry Baker, I'm so grateful that you've given us your time this morning. Thank you so much.
It's really my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay. Can I ask you a little bit before we get into the book? Can I ask you a little bit about working for the Wall Street Journal? Is it an easy job to be the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal?
I wouldn't say it's easy. There are many challenges. When you're, for one thing, you're running, it's a large organization, the Wall Street Journal. We were 1,500 journalists or so. And so, as with any organization like that, that's a lot of kind of managing and hiring and budgets and all the other things, those fun things that you have to do. So that's hard work. And secondly, you have an enormous responsibility. I don't want to kind of overstate it, but you do have an enormous responsibility, and I'm sure we're going to talk about all these things. But trust, as it happens, this is what I thought a lot about trust over the last 10 years or so, because your readers, you have to build a bond of trust with your readers. Your readers have to, you're dealing with, especially something like the Wall Street Journal. Again, I don't want to sound overly sort of self-aggrandizing, but the Journal is a big newspaper. It's very, very widely read. But now we have, nearly 3.5 million, nearly 4 million subscribers. Very influential, read by, people around the world in government and business and, powerful people. And you have an obligation when you have that kind of an audience to reach the very, very highest standards, literally the very highest standards of journalism. You have to make sure that what you write, what you're responsible for, is trusted. And obviously, when you're the editor-in-chief, you are the person who is ultimately responsible for all of that. So when you get something wrong, when somebody gets something wrong, and it has large consequences, I'm accountable for that. So that's kind of demanding and stressful. And then on top of that, you're kind of dealing with all kinds of different interests, right? You're dealing with the interest of the staff, your readers, most of all, staff, the bosses. You're always conscious of what they're thinking. So all of that's going on. But one thing I would say is that the real joy of being editor of the Journal was that I've worked now for many different major news organizations in both the UK and the United States. The joy about the Journal, and I would say this is distinctive about the Journal, is that the quality of the work there, the quality of the reporters and editors, and indeed the institutions that have been structured at the Journal to produce journalism, really are the very, very highest. And so in a strange way, you ask, was it easy? In a strange way, one part of the job was quite easy, which was, when you're dealing with a story that someone's got, especially an explosive one, and we dealt with many of them, big investigation, something like that, the quality of the reporting and the quality and the rigor of the editing is so high at the Journal that you could be confident. You have a high level of confidence that the story was right. I very rarely had to worry that, that a story was in any significant way wrong, that we were going to publish. Obviously, we have layers of editing. We have obviously legal teams like everybody does. But at the Journal, the standard is just so high that it never really a major concern for me to think, is a journalist promoting a particular agenda here? Have they really been fair to the person that they're writing about? Have they, checked all their facts? Have the various editors we have checked all the facts? You really could be confident that again, because of the quality that you weren't going to make that. I made lots of other mistakes as editor of the Journal, but that was a mistake that you didn't have to worry too much about. So that part was, again, I wouldn't say easy, but it was very gratifying to have a team of people who worked for the Journal, who were, who had such high standards.
Yeah. And journalism and the media come up a lot in your book. And there's an idea you put forth that journalists are really these supposed to be, experts in truth and like finding truth. And of course, you don't want to overstate it because you're very humble. But I think a lot of people see that role as really being, one of the most important arbiters of truth in our country. And so I think it's very appropriate that your book about trust and your book about truth is coming from that perspective, that journalistic perspective that you have.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I came to the book. Well, I sort of came, various paths brought me to this book, but one of them was particularly obviously journalism. I've been a journalist for 35 years. Trust is essentially, again, obviously, as with everything you do in life, trust is absolutely essential. But in journalism, it's particularly important because you are playing an important role. You're giving people information that they are going to see or read, and they're going to absorb in some way, and it's going to affect the way they think about their lives, about their livelihoods, about the world, about government, about everything. And so you have a tremendous responsibility when you're doing that to make sure that what you're doing is right. So and over the years, it became more and more clear to me that trust was just breaking down, and that trust was being, I'm sorry to say this, but was being broken, indeed even betrayed, by journalism that was increasingly unreliable, increasingly partisan, increasingly agenda-driven, and increasingly untrustworthy. And that, so yes, that, you know, it was seeing up close. Again, I stress not at the Journal. I mean, we had some episodes of the Journal that I would, you know, which left me uncomfortable, but by and large, the journal's quality, as I said, is extraordinarily high. But if I looked around, as I looked around me, especially over the last 10 years or so, at news organizations, by the way, including news organizations that I'd worked for, and I say it out loud, the BBC, where I spent almost 10 years, the Financial Times, where I spent 10 years, these organizations were just, you know, again, still high quality journalists with highly intelligent, high quality organizations with high quality journalists, but they were just becoming, you know, I felt, and I do feel very strongly, increasingly agenda driven, increasingly partisan, and as a result, increasingly untrustworthy. And that led me to reflect more broadly on the importance of trust and what's happened to it across society.
Okay, cool. So, okay, the book, American Breakdown, as we've already touched upon, you know, from your perspective, it sort of stands above politics in a way, I would say. It's not partisan in its tone. You know, you are interested in addressing this question of, you know, what happened to trust in our society? What are the implications of that lack of trust? And you have a lot to say about both sides of the political spectrum. And I think you've already pointed out that that's sort of a characteristic of good journalism in general. I would add, you know, the book sort of feels like almost encyclopedic. Like there's, you know, so many angles on this issue of trust that you try to address. So I made a brief list off the top of my head, but like, you know, media, doctors, politicians, elites, globalization, academics, including liberal universities, you know, liberal immigration policies, you know, tech companies, the 2008 financial crisis, the war in Iraq, COVID-19, and that list can probably be continued. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that you sort of reeled off there some of the episodes I talk about, I look at in the book, and trying to explain what's gone wrong and why trust has declined. I mean, you know, the premise for the book is a pretty obvious one, but as I dug into it, it became more and more striking and startling to me, which is, you know, the American public has lost trust, lost faith in almost all of the most important institutions in the country. And you've just talked about them, the media, the government, big business, you know, science, even technology, medicine, education, all of these crucial institutions, these pillars of a democratic society, pillars of any society, particularly trust is particularly important, obviously, in a democratic society. The Americans have lost faith in them. And as I dug into it, as I say, what I found was, you know, data, obviously, how strongly the data supported or illustrated that problem. Gallup do a survey every year in which they ask Americans, they've been doing it for about 50 years, you know, do you have a high level of confidence in the following institutions? And all those institutions I mentioned, they talk about, and every single one, with the exception of two, actually, which we can talk about, of the sort of 15 or 16 institutions that Gallup asks people about, has seen not just a decline in trust now in the last 30 years, but a collapse in trust. I mean, a really precipitous plummeting in the number of trust. The media's the most extreme example, down from, you know, people, more than half the country in the 1970s and 80s said they basically trusted the media, down to like 15% today. But everything, big business, again, the permanent government, federal government, law enforcement, technology, medicine, things I don't dig into too much detail in the book, but obviously things like churches, you know, religious institutions. So, you know, institutions of civil society too, you know, trade unions, all of these things have just, you know, Americans no longer trust them. And perhaps most interestingly and most worryingly, and I devote a chapter of the book to this, they've lost trust in each other too. You know, again, measures of whether or not of the extent to which people have faith in other Americans to do the right thing. Obviously, nobody's kind of naive about it. Everybody expects people to look out for their own interests. But 20 or 30 years ago, relatively large numbers of Americans said, by and large, I can trust my fellow Americans to do the right thing. Now they don't trust. Now Americans don't trust each other. That's partly political, and I'm sure we'll get into this. It's partly partisanship that, Republicans and Democrats now view each other with an incredible hostility, which is very disturbing. But it's broader than that. And again, I try to get at that in the book, the sort of social disintegration that I think we've seen from things like, the advent of personal technology, the smartphone, social media, creating this increasingly kind of atomized society, which people don't really relate to each other. And as a result, they have less and less trust in each other. And that, again, as I say, trust is absolutely essential for a society to function, to be able to function. If you just think about it the most obvious way, we have to trust the food that we're buying from the grocery store is healthy, that the planes we fly on are airworthy. If you don't have trust in these basic institutions and in each other, society just can't survive.
Yeah. Despite all this, all the breadth of topics that you touch upon, I'm going to try to summarize what I thought was maybe the main takeaway, and you can tell me how I do. I'll try it in 6 words. The elites are out of touch. Is that the core of your book?
Yeah, that's basically it. Look, there are, again, and I thank you for saying at the beginning, as you did, this is not a kind of partisan book. I mean, I come from a conservative perspective. I write for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and everybody knows where that's coming from. And people know where I'm coming from. But I tried, and again, in the book, I talk about, how Republicans, conservatives have diminished trust too. Donald Trump's claims about the stolen election, I think, continue to damage a lot of people. That's probably the single most important practical example we have right now about how people don't trust things. And that's largely the fault of Donald Trump and Republicans. So I try to be, I take and I look at other. And there are many factors here, and one of the things I do in the book is try to, kind of analyze and atomize the various factors that I think have created mistrust. I do think, for example, again, and this isn't a particularly conservative thing to say, I think the growth of income inequality and wealth inequality is an enormously important factor over the last 30 or 40 years. I think that's leading to mistrust, mutual mistrust and mistrust of institutions, because Americans no longer think their society is fair. They don't, and we have now remarkable polling evidence that Americans don't think their children are going to do worse than them. They don't think there are opportunities. The opportunities in this country are fair. They've kind of lost faith in the American dream. I think economic inequality is a lot responsible for that. But you're absolutely right that I do think the core of why these crucial institutions, again, not to just continually relist them, but the media, the permanent government, big business, technology, to some extent, science and medicine. I think the core reason, education, particularly higher education, but also K through 12 educational institutions, I do think you're right, that as you describe it, I think these institutions have essentially been captured in the last 30 years or so by an elite, a kind of self-perpetuating elite that is expensively educated, geographically quite concentrated in the country, ideologically kind of monocultural and sort of monolithic. They tend to be people who subscribe to the sort of modern canon of left-wing progressive orthodoxy, and they have taken over these institutions, or they've risen to the top of these institutions, however you want to describe it. And they've taken these institutions and they've taken the kind of the what they stand for and the message they present. They've taken them in a direction that is a long way from where most Americans are on, everything from immigration to globalization, globalization to the big cultural issues that we're dealing with all the time, of race and sex and gender and sexuality and all of that. And I think that these institutions have gone in that direction, far away from where most Americans are. And as a result, and by the way, they've used those institutions to promote, and this is, I think, perhaps one of the most striking things we've seen in the last 10 years or so, big business, chief executives have used their power, their enormous economic and social power, to promote a kind of political and cultural agenda, which again, I think not every, there's significant support for it, but large numbers of Americans, a majority of Americans, are just not comfortable with. And yes, so I think we have this problem of elites that control these institutions, that are out of touch, and actually not just out of touch, but actually dismissive of and disdainful of the values that I think traditionally Americans have adhered to, and they're disdainful and dismissive of the Americans who hold those values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would love if we had time, I'd love to read some of the section of the Davos man. I feel like it's some of the most poetic language in the book. Maybe just to read one sentence of I think of a much larger section here, but quote, "Modern Davos is a perfect metaphor for the world the modern elites have created. The place has the feeling of a secure redoubt, like a medieval castle where the royal court gathers behind the high walls to make the critical decisions for the peasants outside, whose angry cries can be heard in the distance, growing steadily and ominously louder." Is that your experience? I mean, have you ever been to Davos? Is that your experience?
Yeah. I'm afraid I'm a regular at Davos. I'm, sometimes.
Are you a Davos man?
Yeah, I am a Davos. I'm a Davos man, but I'm one of those. Well, I went to Davos largely, ex officio, as it were. They invite the editors and senior editors of major news organizations. So when I was editor of in fact, initially deputy editor of the journal, I started to go. And look, Davos is, I'll say it, unapologetically, it's a great place to go because so many people gather. It is the place, the sort of whatever it is, sort of second or third week of January every year. The timing makes it very good because it's sort of a year ahead. But there's no other gathering in the world like it in the course of a year, where chief executives, heads of government, senior officials, thinkers, authors, non-governmental organization officials. It's an extraordinary gathering. So as a journalist, which is what I am first and foremost, it's an extraordinary opportunity to just talk to so many people and hear so many people who are movers and shakers in the world in the course of 4 days. It's an extraordinary opportunity, and that's why I go. However, obviously, it's more than that, and it has it's a cultural phenomenon too, and this is what I'm writing about here in the book, where it is unfortunately it's at the same time as being a great gathering of all these people, it's a concentration of this modern, if you like, sort of global progressive ideology that they all think alike pretty well. There are a few people like me, a few people who are dissenters, who are kind of tolerated as sort of official dissenters, but they all basically subscribe to the same views on climate change, globalization, open borders, all of the kind of things that we're all very familiar with, and all of the kind of political doctrines that they subscribe to, and that in that sense, Davos and Davos, obviously, Davos is kind of because of what it is and who goes. The chief executives, as I say, of all the major companies pretty well in the world, and the heads of governments, particularly in Europe, but many Asian countries go too, and the United States sends a significant number of people too. It is that locus where these people who have created this sort of post-Cold War world of borderless capitalism, promoting globalization. It is that is the ethos of Davos. It's its ideal. It's animating it's animating ideology, and that is, and again, so I think it does, it's easy to identify it and to use it as a kind of proxy for, as a physical, an annual gathering, as a proxy for what I think has been this, incredibly, ultimately quite damaging, very damaging sort of, progressive ideology that's taken over so many of these institutions.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. I expect most conservatives to be pro globalization. Obviously, Trump, I think, reoriented what conservatism and the Republican Party means. Was Trump sort of an eye-opener for you in terms of coming to this sort of perspective, or was this something that you've always felt?
To some extent, no. But he kind of crystallized it to some extent, and obviously, made it a defining political moment, and in many ways, redefined the Republican Party and redefined conservatism in the way that he did. But no, I mean, the tension between free markets, if you like, I hate this term, but let's use it because everybody kind of knows what it means. Sort of neoliberalism, the kind of neoliberalism of Reagan and Thatcher, that, the idea of free markets, free movement of, capital and goods and people, that is an absolutely an intrinsically conservative idea. It's certainly, rooted in, well, maybe some people would disagree with saying it's intrinsically conservative, but it certainly became, it fits logically with a conservative perspective of freedom, right? If conservatism is, leave us alone, then tearing down borders, tearing down, tariffs and everything else, letting people move freely. That was, and particularly under Reagan and Thatcher, became sort of the defining, almost characteristic of conservatism. But it was always at odds, and we should absolutely note this. It was always at odds with other strands of conservatism, in particular, the national interest, if you like, and defending, putting the nation first. And by the way, I mean, so I think I first came to this, the realization of this tension, actually when I was still living in Britain in the 1980s and 1990s, because that was the kind of defining tension in the Conservative Party in Britain. Margaret Thatcher, I mean, it is incredible. Britain, obviously, conservatives are now identified heavily with Brexit, and we're taking Britain out of the European Union and opposing the integration of Europe in the political and economic integration in Europe that the European Union represents. That's a conservative, strongly conservative perspective now. It certainly has been for the last 30 years. But of course, it was Margaret Thatcher, in pursuit of this neoliberal ideal of free markets and free peoples, if you like, who actually enthusiastically and eagerly signed up to the European Union in the 1980s, and in fact was an animator of what was known as the Single European Act, which created the single market. And then, and in the process, she unwittingly unleashed this incredible tension in the Conservative Party, but more broadly in the conservative movement. So that tension between so it has been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. It's been bubbling up here. It hasn't been such. It was very big in Britain in the 1990s and the early 2000s as conservatives grappled with the problem of Europe and European integration and the loss of national sovereignty in this increasingly, European European superstate idea. It wasn't such a big deal until you're right, until sort of Trump came along and basically articulated some of those same thoughts and ideas that we want to put nationhood first. And then there are some interesting, there's some interesting intellectual ferment going on among conservatives, who've become very critical of Reagan, who've become very critical of neoliberalism, of that sort of ideologically, pure free market approach. So, but in America, yes, it's true. I think that only, I think but what Trump was able to do was to articulate and channel the rising discontent among conservatives, among Republican voters, around many Americans with this free market ideal. And, that's part of the reason for his success. And it's part of the reason the Republican Party is now and the conservative movement generally is in such, I would say, disarray, because not just because of Trump's personality and the bad aspects of that, but because of this, does it want to be a populist, nationalist party, or does it want to go back to being the Ronald Reagan party? And that tension's been there, but it's become acute over the last few years.
Yeah, I'm just asking because historically, following American politics since, for a long time and reading about it, I've always understood being anti, that globalist free trade is the leftist project. I mean, I remember even when I was very young, the WTO riots in Seattle, when they, were burning the city down because of a meeting of, international trade agreements. And Bernie Sanders has long been associated with, immigration restrictionism and these kind of things. So obviously what we're seeing is sort of a realigning. But I think it's interesting is the way that the Davos image, the Davos elite is a target and has long been a target, I think, from both sides of the political spectrum. I think a lot of people on the left have always been equally, to use loosely the word, but conspiratorial language about this, again, these elites meeting and planning out for, our future.
To be clear, let me be clear. I don't buy the Davos conspiracy. The World Economic Forum is a sort of puppet master. Governments jump to its tune. The World Economic Forum is just, again, it's It really is basically a gathering place. It's a gathering place of like-minded people, and this is my point. Whenever my conspiracy-minded friends say, "Ah, but they all go to Davos and they're all World Economic Forum is driving," it's not. They all happen to think alike anyway. You know what I mean? It's not. No one tells the CEO of a major investment bank in the United States, or the head of government in France, or in or a leading political figure in the Democratic Party. No one's telling them what to think or what to say. They just happen to have a shared view about the importance of. I just wrote a column this week in the Journal. I'm sorry to sort of switch subjects slightly, but where I tried to capture what I think is this new ideological kind of moral order, which I think is based on three pillars. I think it's based on sort of the idea that our moral obligation is to the world first, not to nations. That's why they believe in open borders and globalization and all of that. It's climate catastrophism, that we are facing an absolute existential climate threat, and that we have to radically reorder our economies in order to deal with that, which basically means sacrificing economic growth in order to deal with the climate threat. And this kind of new, for want of a better word, woke cultural annihilation, the sort of self-annihilation of our culture, which is that we're terrible, we white Western male patriarchy is lorded over the rest of the world, and we've got to spend the rest of our lives and the rest of eternity making reparations for it. Those pillars, which I argue in my column this week, which are crumbling, I think they are crumbling, are the defining, I think the three key defining elements of this new moral canon, this new moral law, this new ideology that has gripped people. And the people who go to Davos subscribe, that nobody tells them you've got to do this, you've got to get down on your knees and swear allegiance to us and to this ideology. They believe it. They are enthusiastic, sort of self-propelling adherence to those beliefs. So it's not that, again, sorry to go on about this, but it's important. It's not that Davos represents some massive global conspiracy. It represents a coming together of many of the most powerful people in the world, who, as it happens, all think alike.
Right. But also conspiracy in the literal meaning of the word, I think I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, then I apologize. But like people planning like together, a collaboration, but not in the conspiratorial sense in which that's usually meant, But
and to be fair, you're right. Yes, they're very open. I mean, conspiracy does. Again,
it has the connotation which is not intended in this case, but
yeah. I mean, again, there's also usually it implies some sort of element of secrecy, or
correct. Yeah, that's true. I don't mean
that there's no secrecy about it. They're up there every, they go, and you can go. We can't.
And the reporters,
you can watch it. There's 1,000 reporters who go and report on it, and so you can see what they're doing. There's not like. And again, having been to Davos for 10 years, there's not like some secret gathering that goes on behind closed doors, and when the head of the World Economic Forum tells people what they're going to do, it's all there, and it's all very public. I happen to disagree with a lot of what they say, but it's not that there's this sort of organized conspiracy of these people to kind of to drive the world in a particular direction.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of problems, so to speak, in your book, in the sense of ways in which trust is broken down. There's a lot of culprits. There's a lot of elements and angles. There's also some solutions. But let's maybe talk a little about those solutions. So let's pick income inequality, for example. We mentioned that already in this conversation. It comes up in your book. When we talk about Davos, I think a lot of that is sort of just a symbol for this plutocratic elite. The way in which wealth has been distributed in our society. Are there solutions for addressing income inequality?
Yeah, I think there are. So first of all, let me say I'm not in favor of measures to impose kind of redistribution, income redistribution. I don't think the tax. I'm broadly speaking in favor of smaller government, lower taxes. I do not believe. I mean, we have an incredibly progressive tax system as it is, right? I mean, as we know, half of Americans basically don't pay any tax at all. I don't know I can't remember the exact number now, but a very, very substantial proportion income taxes are paid by the top 5% of income earners in the country. So we have a very progressive system as it is. I don't
compared to Europe, though, compared to other modern developed countries. I mean, we don't have a value added tax, which I believe is very progressive, right?
Yeah, it's not quite as progressive as others, but it's still very progressive. I mean, and you'd be surprised actually that some European countries have a less progressive.
Right. Scandinavian countries famously do, but again, value added tax, I think makes it hard to do an apples to apples comparison. Yeah. Also, and then also there's also the labor laws and the power of labor in those countries, right? In Scandinavian European model, labor is very powerful, has a lot of negotiating power.
And you could do things. I mean, again, I'm not really in favor of redistribution of should we say bargaining power against some people. And again, there are some conservatives who are talk about this right now, who think that actually having regarded labor unions in a fairly hostile way for years now, think actually, well, maybe labor, I mean, and if you just look at the numbers in a very simplistic way, the share, what economists call the capital share and the labor share, the share of economic economic output that is divided between capital and labor over the last 40 years has gone dramatically more towards capital and away from labor. So that's part of the reason for income inequality. And one way of redressing that is one reason for that clearly is the decline in power of labor unions. And one way of redressing that would be to find ways to increase the power of labor unions, which you could do, for example, and you could follow the German model where they actually, labor unions are actually given this consultative role on government boards, the so-called Mitbestimmung approach. I'm not in favor of any. I'm just saying that is one way you could do it. I'm not in favor of any of that. I think the core reason for I think there are 2 or 3 core reasons for the rise in inequality which could be redressed. But the core reason is the growth in economic power to essentially to large corporations, but to generally speaking to owners and managers over labor. And I think that's come about in large part because of globalization. I think what we've seen, the opportunity to substitute low-cost labor overseas for relatively high-cost labor in the United States has unquestionably, I think, led to growth in inequality. It's created enormous economic returns for the owners of capital and the managers of companies, understandably, because it's enabled them to generate huge profits at the expense of domestic American workers. Now that is changing already, and I think that more can be done to do that. And I'm not in favor of. I'm against tariffs because in the end I think tariffs hurt people. But I think what we're seeing is this. What's so-called reshoring, nearshoring, the return of jobs to the United States, which we are seeing in quite significant numbers. Growth of manufacturing jobs is a striking thing. I mean, I'm of a generation that grew up just assuming that manufacturing jobs were going to just continue to decline in major industrialized countries, and they did for 30, 40 years there. But they are coming back. So more measures to promote domestic manufacturing is certainly one way to do it. I really do think, though, and I'm slightly messianic on this topic. I think part of the reason for the growth in power of corporations is the failure of markets in the United States, by which I mean particularly the dramatic concentration of power of again, economists refer to it as industrial concentration. That is the reduction in the number of companies in each sector of the economy competing against each other. We don't really have much competition, I'm sorry to say, in the United States, not as much as we did 40 or 50 years ago. In every major sector, pretty well every major sector of the US economy now is dominated by 3 or 4 companies. Take, the perfect example is airlines. Airlines is a really good example that we've seen through consolidation and mergers. Basically, 3 or 4 airlines now have something like 80% of the domestic traffic in the United States. And guess what happens when that happens? You get oligopolistic practices. They try and book a flight from St. Louis to New York tomorrow, and you'll probably have 2 choices. I'm guessing it'll be American Airlines and maybe United or something like that. And surprise, surprise, the fare will be almost exactly the same. Wherever these airlines fly, they have exactly the same price. They have, again, I'm not directly accusing them of collusion, but it's quite striking and quite surprising that the price, with only 2 airlines, it's not surprising that with only 2 airlines, you end up with very little choice in terms of price. And that is true. It's true in pharmaceuticals, it's true in other transportation, it's true in technology, it's true in telecommunications, it's true in sector after sector of the finance of the US economy has become incredibly concentrated, which leads to standard economics, just leads to very, very high levels of, what economists call economic rent to the owners, and therefore that's dramatically increased their profits and their and has been a big contributor to, and obviously the returns that go to their owners and to their managers, and that's been a big factor contributing to inequality. So I think trust busting, to go, to use a familiar and old term in America, I think that would be one way to start to redress the balance. I do also, because the other thing that these companies do is they use their economic power for political power. They are incredibly influential. They will have massive lobbying presences in Washington and state capitals. If we start to break up the power of big companies, I genuinely think we would start to see a reduction in inequality, and I think that would actually help to sort of rebuild some of the bonds of trust that have dissolved.
So would you point to Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that said money is speech, that gave corporations the power to do unlimited, invisible?
I struggle with that. I'm very much a free speech absolutist, to quote Elon Musk, and so I hate any attempts to restrict free speech, and I'm sympathetic completely with the ideology, if you can call it that, behind that decision. That I think companies should be free. So I'm skeptical anyway about campaign finance restrictions, because I think companies find ways around them. That said, I think you can't look at the United States and look at the amount of money that is in the political system in the United States and compare it with other countries and not be concerned about it, and not be concerned about the power, the dependence of candidates on money, for obvious reasons, because of the media, the need to increase their presence. It is corrosive. I mean, it's incredibly corrosive. I just don't think you can look at what's going on, on a policy level in Washington, and see what happens, see the way lobbying works, and see that the symbiosis between political figures and companies, and not be concerned about it. I don't know that reversing Citizens United is the right way to go about it, but I do think we have to think hard about dealing with the problem of money in US political life.
As a conservative, can you point the finger at the Republican Party and conservatives as having accelerated that trend, historically speaking, as being against? The Democratic Party is associated with trust busting, is associated with breaking up big corporations. The Democratic Party is considered historically an opponent to globalization, is considered an opponent to dark money being funneled into political campaigns. Are you able to point the finger at the Republican Party for accelerating this?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, after all, this has gone on under, administrations and Congresses of both parties for the last 30 years. This process I'm talking about, this concentration has gone on. Again, I part with a lot of my conservative friends here in that I'm quite, I'm not completely supportive of what the administration is doing and going after Google or going after Amazon, as it is now, just as announced this week. But I am supportive, generally speaking, of a more aggressive approach to antitrust. The reason I think conservatives allowed, some conservatives, not all, but I think some conservatives have confused the interests of business with the interests of the wider economy, or they put it another way, they have confused the interests of business with the interests of a free market. And I think, again, if you look at sector after sector in the US, you don't have a very free market in many of these sectors. And another illustration of that, by the way, and another problem, which again I think can be laid at conservatives' doors too, in part, is we don't have a very dynamic economy anymore. The one thing that's gone wrong in the US, and I talk about this in the book a bit, is over the last 20 years, a dramatic decline in the dynamism of the economy in terms of the creativity of startups, right? With the number of startups in the US economy has declined. It's actually picked up a little bit in the last few years, but if you go back over 25 years, it's declined dramatically. The number of public companies has declined dramatically. We've gone to a increasingly private private equity led and sort of private enterprise led economy, rather than a big, vibrant, dynamic market where companies are being created all the time. People have an opportunity to start. There's too much red tape that a lot of that could be resolved through deregulation, but a lot of it also again comes down to the power of big companies who are basically able to create barriers to entry to prevent startups and smaller companies coming along. Or when they do come along, technology is a perfect example of this. Like everybody in Silicon Valley, which is a model of dynamism in many ways, created over the last 30 years has created an extraordinary number of companies and products. But the model there right now is, you want to start up, and you want to be a startup in Silicon Valley, so that you start off, you raise significant amounts of money, you become successful, and then you're bought by Google or Microsoft or Apple. That's your objective, and that does happen all the time. And I don't think that's healthy. And I think that is, and again, conservatives have essentially at minimum tolerated that, if not actually facilitated that over the years. And I think that is a mistake.
Yeah. What I worry about is we're all trying to live the American dream. We're all trying to succeed and thrive in this country. And I feel like we have to give people a way to say that if you feel like you're falling short, there are political levers you can pull to change our society for the better. But if those levers aren't available, if people feel there's no political option for them, if there's no political party or no political representative that will improve their lives in a material way, then they turn on democracy. And they feel like democracy itself is actually not working. And that's what I fear. Does that resonate at all or no?
It does. No. I agree completely. Yeah. And again, I mean, you put it very well. I don't put it in exactly those terms in the book, but I think that's right. I think it is a sense that the system has failed. I mean, again, when you have, for most Americans, the last 20 years, again, this is one of the things I talk about in the book. The last 20 years have not been very good for the United. I mean, I guess, and again, the irony is, and I try to capture this in the early part, in the introduction to the book. I came to America. I came to live here in the 1990s. I came here and lived here. I've lived here since 1996. At that point, America was at its, what we now sadly have to look back on and say at its zenith, right? At its summit. It was extraordinary. It had won the Cold War. Its model had been demonstrated to be better than any other in the world. The economy actually at that point was booming, was dynamic. It was creating, incredible growth. We had astonishing growth in the 1990s. It had beaten all comers. The United States was a place everybody wanted to be. It was the greatest, unquestionably the greatest country on earth. And Americans generally felt pretty good about themselves. I mean, we can argue about some of the things that went on in the 1990s, but Americans generally felt pretty good about themselves. The last 20 years, you now see these numbers where Americans are asked if the country's on the right track or the wrong track. For the last 10 years or so, it's been consistently a huge majority of people saying it's on the wrong track. And then you ask, why is that? Well, because things have not gone very well. The economic growth has stalled from that period, from the 80s and the 90s, when we had, 4% and 3% growth. We're now down to like 2% growth. We have, we've had terrible foreign policy experiences. I'm sorry to say this, I was a supporter of the Iraq War, but I think the Iraq War was one of the most disastrous decisions and certainly the most disastrously executed foreign policy acts in American history, and has caused unbelievable, not only damage, not only loss of life, most importantly, American lives, most importantly, but the damage to American esteem in the world, but also self-esteem. I think it's really sapped, and Afghanistan, which was obviously a more complicated story, because it was initially went extremely well, and only latterly, we started to realize we were not succeeding as we'd hoped. But these so huge foreign policy failures, an economy that hasn't performed anything like as well as it used to in the past, the massive growth of inequality, the lack of opportunity for hundreds of millions of Americans. And they watch all this, and then they see, an immigration situation where we have no control over the border, and, millions and millions of people coming in, illegal, entering the country illegally. This culture stuff going on, which is going on at a pace that most Americans can't begin to understand or tolerate. I mean, if you'd said to someone 10 years ago, it will become a kind of item of faith among a large number of, the political class, that there's no such thing as a woman, or, we can't define the difference between a man and a woman, you'd have said I was completely insane. That is now the orthodox.
Also same thing for homosexuality, right? The idea that two men can get married. But now that's largely accepted, because these things evolve, like culture evolves.
No, I do accept. No, and again, I was against gay marriage 20 years ago. Now I'm in support of it. It is. I think what we've got to be careful of is denouncing people who continue to believe, for example, who don't believe in gay marriage or continue to hold the old-fashioned view that sex is real, that the biological sex is real. And I always remind people, Barack Obama, icon of progressive liberalism, Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, saying he believed that marriage was between a man and a woman.
Of course,
against gay marriage. He opposed it and he would oppose it. Okay, I'm not saying. I'm not saying he's. We've all changed our minds on
things. Change fast. Yeah,
that was 2008, and again, within a decade. Vast majority of people accepted it. So, but all I'm saying is we need to understand that for many Americans, the pace of this revolution, this sort of cultural revolution that we've seen, again, and I'm comfortable with gay marriage, as I think most Americans are. I'm not comfortable with some of the other aspects of this cultural revolution. So anyway, so back to your larger question. Yeah, I think that's right. I think people see all this going on, and there might be individual problems that they see. And by the way, we can add to that, as we started talking about earlier, the problems that technology and social media have created. I think we have a massive, and I think this, and I wish I'd spent more time in the book on this. I talk a little bit about it, but there is now some really interesting research and data that we're getting on the pathologies of technology and social media, what's happening to our particularly young people, loneliness, mental health issues, isolation, social atomization, that I think is being heavily driven by social media technology and all that. So they look at all this, and so all of these things, which are all kinds of different problems, and they say, the system is failing us. The whole system is failing, and you're right, democracy is failing. I think that's a very worrying trend. I don't think we've seen that in America in 100 years. People actually saying, it's not just I want to change the government. It's like, and I'm going to vote for a different party at the next election. It's like the whole system doesn't work. And this is, again, what's kind of what I get at in my book about trust. People just think all of these institutions that make up the system, the country, the society, they've all failed us. And therefore the society, the system has failed us.
Yeah, Jerry Baker, I'll say that I have no books in my background, but whenever I talk to someone with like beautiful bookshelves, I get very excited. And it makes me think I would love to talk to you longer about your intellectual interests and your expertise.
Another time we can do. I'm happy to talk. I love talking about this. It's the nice thing about writing a book actually is, and I hadn't properly appreciated this. Somebody said this, captured this very well, is that writing a book, it's almost, I don't, whether or not it sells 100 or 1 million copies, it gives you a real opportunity to really dig into a topic. I mean, I write a weekly column for the Journal, which I love doing. I also write a weekly column for the Times of London, which I love doing. I do a podcast like yourself, but you're on a weekly cycle, and inevitably you're following the news, and you're inevitably offering impressionistic takes on something, and then you're on to the next topic. When you write a book, you really get into the topic in quite some detail. And I would never claim the mantle of expertise, which I think is one of the problems we have in this country. We have too many so-called experts who tell us things, but it does give you just a rare depth in a particular topic, which I've really enjoyed, actually, and I've really appreciated. And again, I wouldn't claim to be, I'm not an academic, I'm not a scholar, I wouldn't claim to be an expert really on anything, but I feel like, I've really dug into this, and that's, so I want to do more. And I have a wide range of intellectual interests, and, happy to talk about them again with you.
This was a really special conversation for me. I'm really, really grateful for your time. Thank you. And I recommend your book to anyone interested in this sort of this angle on America's situation right now. I think it's an excellent analysis. Thank you so much, Jerry Baker.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you.